February 19th, 1945. Iwo Jima, Volcano Islands. The sea is still burning. Black sand spits beneath the boots of Private First Class Daniel Mercer as he crouches behind a half-buried landing craft, the air thick with sulfur and cordite. Ahead of him, Mount Suribachi rises like a broken tooth against a gray sky, steep, ash-covered, and according to intelligence briefings, unsuitable for armor. The Japanese defenders believe the same. Inside a reinforced tunnel halfway up the slope, Lieutenant Kenji Takahashi of the Imperial Japanese Army presses his ear to the periscope housing. He hears machine gun fire, naval bombardment, the shriek of incoming shells, but no engines. The Americans have landed infantry and flamethrower teams. Tanks, everyone knows, cannot climb volcanic ash that shifts like water underfoot. The terrain is their ally. Then he hears a low, grinding roar. Metal against grit, the beachhead. An M4A3 Sherman tank lurches forward, its tracks biting into the soft black sand. The Marines have welded extended grousers, steel cleats bolted to each track link, specifically for this terrain. The tank commander, Staff Sergeant Harold Red Bannon, leans out of the turret, goggles coated in ash. "Keep her steady," he shouts down into the hull. "Second gear, don't let her bog." The Sherman bucks, but keeps climbing. From the Japanese observation slit, Takahashi sees something he had not prepared for. American armor pushing upward toward positions considered unreachable by heavy vehicles. The ground trembles. The war on Iwo Jima was meant to be an infantryman's nightmare, a labyrinth of tunnels and concealed artillery, immune to naval fire. General Tadamaki Kurabayashi designed it that way. He had ordered his men to avoid wasteful banzai charges and instead fight from prepared defenses, turning the island into a fortress of interlocking fire. But even he had assumed the slopes would slow American armor to a crawl, if not halt it entirely. On the beach below, Corporal Miguel Herrera of the 4th Marine Division stares in disbelief as the Sherman crests a ridge that hours earlier had pinned his platoon under crossfire. "We thought tanks would sink," he mutters. Instead, the 33-ton machine grinds upward, turret rotating. Its 75mm main gun flashes that a Japanese pillbox vanishes in smoke. Inside the tunnel, Takahashi feels dust fall from the ceiling. The Americans are not just advancing. They are rewriting the geometry of the battlefield. By midday, 3 Shermans have clawed their way up ash-covered inclines once marked tank impassable on Japanese defensive maps. They fire point-blank into bunker apertures that had only prepared for horizontal infantry assaults. And suddenly, the slopes are no longer safe. The roar of American engines echoes against volcanic rock, a sound the defenders had not anticipated, and one that signals a shift no one on the island can yet measure. The roar does not fade, it grows louder. February 20th, 1945. Southern Sector, Iwo Jima. Inside the hull of the Sherman nicknamed Cactus King, Sergeant William Harlow grips the steering levers, his knuckles white beneath grime-streaked gloves. The volcanic ash behaves like dry snow. Every turn threatens to bury the tank to its belly. "Easy, easy," he mutters to himself. Above him, Staff Sergeant Bannon scans the ridgeline through binoculars. He can see the mouth of a concealed gun positioned halfway up Suribachi, a 47mm anti-tank cannon carefully embedded in concrete. It had been placed to fire down at infantry along the beaches, not uphill at advancing armor. "Driver, angle left. Give me hull, defilade." The Sherman pivots awkwardly, its extended track grousers clawing into the slope. Ash sprays behind it in thick plumes. The engine strains but holds. Inside a nearby bunker, Lieutenant Takahashi watches the impossible unfold. They are climbing. One of his corporals whispers. Takahashi says nothing. He had studied American doctrine. Tanks were support weapons, used cautiously in Pacific operations where jungle, coral reefs, and steep terrain limited mobility. On Guadalcanal and Tarawa, armor had struggled. At Paliliu, tanks became trapped in coral ridges and crossfire. But here, on this shifting volcanic mountain, they are adapting. The 47mm gun fires, The shell ricochets off the Sherman's glassy plate with a metallic scream, deflecting upward into the sky. Inside Cactus King, the impact rings like a church bell. Harlow flinches. Hit. Didn't punch through. Bannon shouts back. Traverse right. Target that muzzle flash. The turret rotates with hydraulic precision. The 75mm gun barks. The bunker's firing slit disappears in flame and pulverized concrete. For Japanese defenders who believed elevation guaranteed security, the psychological blow lands harder than the shell, dead on another ridge. A platoon of Japanese riflemen prepares to counterattack an American infantry push. They had expected to fight Marines advancing on foot, exhausted and exposed on open ash slopes. Instead, a second Sherman crests behind the infantry line. One of the M4A3 are 3 flame tanks, nicknamed Zippos by the Marines. The tank halts, the jet of liquid fire erupts from its bow-mounted flamethrower, arching upward toward cave entrances carved into the hillside. Flames cling to rock, flowing into openings like molten water. The defenders recoiled, in the tunnel network below. The ground vibrates again. Takahashi steadies himself against the wall as dust rains down. He understands now. The Americans are not simply forcing their way forward. They're using terrain differently. The steep slopes of Suribachi were meant to channel attackers into predictable lanes of fire. But tanks climbing directly up those faces eliminate those lanes. They create new angles, vertical ones, exposing bunker roofs and ventilation shafts never reinforced against direct assault. BY late afternoon, American armor has reached positions that Japanese planners marked as naturally protected. Protected no longer dead on the lower slopes, Corporal Herrera advances behind the Sherman's bulk, feeling almost invincible in its shadow. Stay tight, his lieutenant shouts. Let the tank lead. For the first time since landing, the Marines are not pinned flat against black sand. They're moving uphill, and with every grinding turn of steel track against volcanic ash, a belief long held by the defenders is collapsing, that the mountain itself would fight for them. February 21st, 1945. Northern approach to Mount Suribachi. The morning begins with fog, thick, sulfurous, clinging low to the slopes like smoke that never left. Inside the command tunnel beneath Suribachi, Lieutenant Kenji Takahashi kneels over a field map spread across a wooden crate. Red pencil marks indicate overlapping fields of fire. Arrows show expected American routes of advance. All of them assume one thing. The slopes above 20 degrees are safe from armor. A runner bursts in, breathless. Lieutenant. American tanks have reached the secondary ridge line. Takahashi looks up sharply. Impossible. But it is not. Outside, 3 Shermans advance in staggered formation, engines roaring against the wind. Their crews have learned quickly. They do not climb straight up the steepest grades. They zigzag, reducing the incline angle. Drivers keep momentum steady, never allowing the tank to stall in loose ash. Staff Sergeant Bannon wipes sweat from his brow. The inside of his helmet smells of oil and sulfur. Keep spacing, he calls over the intercom. Watch for mines. Japanese engineers had buried anti-tank mines along likely beach exits and narrow trails. Not on the raw, unstable slopes where no tank was expected to tread. Now the Shermans are bypassing prepared kill zones entirely. A hidden 75mm field gun opens fire from a camouflage casemate. The first round slams into the ground just short of the lead tank, sending a geyser of black ash skyward. Contact front. Harlow shouts. Bannon spots the muzzle flash halfway up the ridge. The gun sits behind reinforced concrete, angled downward. Its protective apron does not cover the upper arc. No one anticipated fire from below at such a steep angle. Load he. The loader rams a high explosive shell into the breach. The Sherman halts briefly. The turret elevates higher than Japanese gunners expected possible from that distance. Boom. The shell detonates against the casemate's exposed upper lip. Concrete fractures. The second shot punches directly into the gun aperture. Silence follows. Then smoke pours from the bunker's mouth. Inside his tunnel, Takahashi feels the concussive thud reverberate through the volcanic rock. Dust coats his uniform. He imagines the field gun crew, men he trained, buried beneath shattered concrete. The mountain is no longer a shield. Above the Marines, Japanese riflemen attempt to reposition through connecting tunnels, emerging behind what they assume are safe rear approaches. But as they crawl from a concealed exit, they freeze, and an American tank is already there. The Sherman's bow machine gun opens up, .30 caliber rounds stitching across the slope. The infantry scatter, stunned. Corporal Herrera crouches beside the tank's hull, heart hammering. He had expected days of inch-by-inch fighting, pinned under enfilade fire from above. Instead, armor has punched upward, breaking the vertical dominance of the defenders. By midday, Suribachi trembles continuously, not from naval bombardment offshore, but from tank engines grinding across terrain marked impassable in every Japanese defensive estimate. Takahashi grips the edge of the map table. Their doctrine assumed gravity was on their side. Now gravity belongs to steel, and the Americans are climbing higher. February 23, 1945. Lower terraces of Mount Suribachi. Dawn breaks in a haze of gray light and drifting ash. The air smells of burnt powder and scorched earth. Second Lieutenant Robert Keller of the 5th Marine Regiment presses himself into a shallow depression behind a Sherman's right tread. The tank's hull is warm, vibrating steadily beneath his shoulder. For 3 days, his platoon has tried to advance up this terrace, and for 3 days, Japanese interlocking machine gun fire has cut them down. The guns are positioned perfectly, angled downward from concealed apertures, their fire converging on narrow paths between ridges, paths meant for infantry. Bring her up another 5 yards. Keller shouts. The Sherman inches forward. Its commander, Staff Sergeant Bannon, studies the ridgeline through his periscope. He can see muzzle flashes from 2 concealed Type 92 heavy machine guns. They're firing too low. Bannon mutters. He rotates the turret upward. Inside his observation post, Lieutenant Takahashi realizes the problem at the same moment. The American tanks are not simply climbing. They are altering the geometry of engagement. By advancing higher than anticipated, they flatten the defenders' firing angles. Machine guns that once dominated the slope now struggle to depress far enough to strike the armored hulls. Adjust elevation. Takahashi orders through a field phone, but some emplacements cannot adjust. They were poured into concrete with fixed arcs of fire, optimized for beach defense, not uphill armor. The Sherman halts. Its 75mm gun fires. The first machine gun nest disappears in smoke and pulverized stone. The second tries to reposition fire onto the Marines trailing the tank, but the tank pivots, exposing its thick frontal armor toward the aperture. Another shell. Another eruption of debris. Keller feels the pressure wave in his chest. Move! Move! He yells. Marines surge forward in the tank's wake, rifles at the ready. For the first time since landing, they are not crawling. They are advancing upright, using the Sherman as a moving wall. Further upslope, an M4A3 R3 flame tank. One of the converted Shermans fitted with a Ronson flamethrower climbs a path Japanese engineers considered too steep for tracked vehicles. Its extended grousers dig deep, throwing ash behind it like a rooster tail. A hidden cave entrance opens fire with rifles and light machine guns. Bullets spark harmlessly off the tank's turret. The flamethrower operator squeezes the trigger. The roaring tongue of fire arcs into the cave mouth, vanishing inside. Seconds later, smoke billows outward. Inside the tunnel network, Takahashi hears screams echo faintly through the rock. He closes his eyes for a moment. The defenders had designed Suribachi to fight horizontally, layers of crossfire from concealed slopes. But American armor has introduced vertical assault. Tanks now sit above some bunker lines, firing down into ventilation shafts and rear access points never reinforced against overhead attack. The mountain's angles are breaking. By mid-morning, American tanks occupy positions halfway up Suribachi, once believed untouchable by heavy vehicles. Japanese artillery observers struggle to recalibrate range tables. Distances and elevations no longer match pre-battle assumptions. Corporal Herrera pauses beside the Sherman and looks back toward the beach. The black sand below is littered with wreckage, but the line of advance is unmistakable. Steel has climbed the volcano, and every yard upward strips away another layer of defensive certainty. February 25th, 1945. Northern Iwo Jima. The fighting has moved beyond Suribachi. Wind sweeps across jagged ridges of broken volcanic rock as Captain James Hollister of the 4th Tank Battalion studies a map pinned against the side of a Sherman. Ahead lies a maze of elevated plateaus and natural terraces, terrain Japanese planners believed would funnel infantry into narrow, pre-sighted corridors. Infantry got chewed up here yesterday, a Marine lieutenant says, pointing at a narrow draw between two ridges. Machine guns on both sides. Hollister nods. Then we won't use the draw. He folds the map and climbs back into his tank. Inside a reinforced command tunnel further north, Lieutenant Takahashi listens to reports filtering in through static-filled field phones. American tanks on the West Ridge. That ridge is impassable, Takahashi snaps without a pause. Then, they're climbing diagonally. Again, the Americans have learned to treat the volcanic landscape, not as a wall, but as a ramp. Sherman crews approach steep inclines at angles, using throttle control and momentum to prevent stalling. Engineers fill craters and stabilize ash paths under fire, sometimes using bulldozer blades mounted on modified tanks. The defenders' calculations are collapsing that on the West Ridge, Hollister's Sherman climbs steadily. The slope is littered with loose rock and sulfur vents that hiss faintly in the wind. The tank's engine groans but does not falter. 30 degrees, the driver mutters, glancing at an improvised inclinometer. Keep it moving, Hollister replies. T the crest, the tank levels out, revealing something the Japanese believed hidden. The rear entrances to several bunker complexes, masked from frontal assault. Hollister sees men scrambling below. Target that trench line. The 75mm gun fires. Concrete shatters. A trench collapses inward. Below, Japanese riflemen stare upward in disbelief. That position was designed to be invisible from the beach and shielded from naval guns by rock. It was never meant to face armor from above. Takahashi receives the report minutes later. Rear trench destroyed. Tanks firing from the ridge. He grips the receiver tighter. The defensive system depended on vertical separation. Infantry would assault uphill, slowed and exposed. Artillery and machine guns would rake them from above. But now American tanks are occupying the high ground, positions once reserved for Japanese observers and artillery spotters. The geometry of dominance has reversed. Corporal Herrera moves cautiously behind Hollister Sherman as it pivots along the ridge. He can see beyond the immediate battlefield now, north toward the Motoyama Airfields, where the next line of resistance waits. We're not supposed to be up here, one Marine whispers, but they are. The tank's engine idles steadily, smoke drifting into the wind. For the Japanese defenders, the realization settles heavily. There are no more safe slopes. No rear approaches immune to armor. No elevated sanctuaries untouched by steel. The volcano has betrayed them, and the Americans are still advancing. February 28, 1945. Approaches to Motoyama Airfield No. 2, Iwo Jima. The wind has shifted north. Ash drifts low across the scarred landscape, revealing the flat expanse of Motoyama Airfield ahead, its runways cratered, its control tower shattered. Beyond it rise ridges honeycombed with tunnels and reinforced firing positions. This is the core of General Tadamaki Kurabayashi's defensive system. Inside one of those tunnels, Lieutenant Kenji Takahashi listens to the steady thunder of engines. Not artillery. Engines. They're crossing the airfield. A signalman reports. Across the open ground, Shermans of the 4th Tank Battalion move in deliberate formation, spaced wide to avoid mines. Engineers have cleared lanes under fire, marking safe paths with white tape and discarded ration tins. Captain Hollister stands half exposed from his turret, binoculars fixed on the northern ridge. Infantry to our right, he radios. We'll draw the fire. It is a calculated risk. The Japanese defensive network around the airfields was designed as a labyrinth, mutually supporting bunkers, concealed anti-tank guns, and mortar pits connected underground. Tanks were expected to enter predictable avenues of approach, where crossfire and mines would trap them. Instead, the Shermans veered toward the flanks, climbing broken embankments bordering the runway. Terrain uneven and sloped, dismissed during defensive planning as unsuitable for armored vehicles. Point 1 tank lurches violently as its track hits a buried mine. The explosion lifts the front hull briefly before it slams back down. Smoke pours from the damaged suspension. Tracks blown. The crew chief shouts over the radio, but the tank is not destroyed. Its armor has held. Point 2 other Shermans pivot immediately, firing high-explosive shells into the suspected minefield perimeter, detonating additional charges before infantry can stumble into them. Inside the ridge tunnel, Takahashi feels the concussions in rapid succession. "They are firing into the minefields," he murmurs. The Americans are dismantling obstacles before fully encountering them. On the northern slope, overlooking the airfield, a concealed Type 147mm anti-tank gun waits. Its arc of fire covers the runway's center, the obvious path of advance. But Hollister's tank does not cross the center. IT climbs the embankment instead. "Target that ridge face," he orders. The Sherman's turret elevates higher than Japanese gunners anticipated. The 75mm shell strikes just above the anti-tank gun's embrasure, collapsing part of the overhang. Dust and debris pour down, blinding the crew inside. Before they can clear their sights, a second shell punches through the weakened aperture. The gun falls silent. Corporal Herrera advances cautiously behind the tanks as they crest the ridge overlooking the airfield's northern defenses. From this vantage point, he can see bunker rooftops, flat concrete slabs designed to withstand naval bombardment from offshore, not direct fire from above. "Hit the roofs," someone yells. Shermans adjust elevation and fire downward. Concrete cracks. Ventilation shafts rupture. Smoke funnels upward from openings never meant to be exposed. Inside the labyrinth, Takahashi steadies himself as dust rains from the ceiling once more. The defensive network still functions, but its invisibility is gone. American armor now occupies elevated positions that pierce the carefully constructed illusion of invulnerability. For days, Japanese soldiers believed the volcanic terrain would negate tanks, forcing Americans into predictable infantry assaults. Instead, the tanks have adapted to the volcano, and the labyrinth is beginning to unravel. March 3, 1945. Northern Iwo Jima. Near Hill 382, the wind carries the smell of burned fuel and charred earth across the shattered ridgelines. Hill 382, the highest point in the northern sector, has become the new anchor of Japanese resistance. Inside a reinforced command chamber carved deep into volcanic rock, General Tadamaki Kurabayashi studies a situation map illuminated by a single hanging bulb. The lines that once marked secure terrain have been crossed out in pencil. American tanks have reached the forward slope of 382, an officer reports quietly. Kurabayashi does not look up at first. He had anticipated overwhelming naval firepower. He had anticipated relentless infantry assaults. He had even prepared for flamethrowers and demolition teams. But the persistent, adaptive use of armor across terrain considered prohibitive. That is the variable that has altered his equation. Outside, Shermans grind upward along the fractured approaches to Hill 382. The terrain here is jagged, scarred by shell fire, riddled with fissures. It should favor defenders. Captain Hollister wipes soot from his face as his tank crawls forward in low gear. "Watch the crest," he warns over the intercom. "That guns will be waiting." There'd a concealed 75mm Japanese field piece fires from a masked embrasure cut into the hillside. The round slams into the side of a Sherman advancing 50 yards to Hollister's left. The impact dents armor but fails to penetrate. The angle too shallow. "Traverse left." Hollister shouts. The Sherman halts just below the ridgeline, exposing only its turret. The gun elevates sharply. Boom! The shell detonates above the embrasure, collapsing part of the rock face. A second shot follows instantly, punching into the firing slit. Silence. Behind the tanks, Marines move cautiously, rifles scanning cave mouths and rubble piles. Corporal Herrera glances uphill and sees something that would have seemed absurd 2 weeks earlier. American armor perched halfway up a volcanic ridge that Japanese planners assumed would serve as a natural fortress wall. Inside the tunnel below, Lieutenant Takahashi braces himself as debris trickles down again. Communications lines flicker in and out. Reports arrive fragmented. Tanks firing from high ground. Roof collapse in Sector 3. They are above us. The last phrase hangs in the air. Above us. The defenders built their system around vertical superiority, firing downward into advancing Marines. Now Shermans occupy slopes overlooking bunker roofs and ventilation points. Concrete designed to resist horizontal impact proves vulnerable to plunging fire. Kurabayashi finally lifts his gaze. Concentrate remaining anti-tank assets on flanking fire, he orders calmly. Do not engage head-on. He understands what many of his junior officers are only now realizing. American tanks are not invincible, but they are persistent. They probe weaknesses. They adjust routes. They exploit gradients once dismissed. On the shattered slope of Hill 382, Hollister's Sherman crests another rise. From there, he can see deep into the defensive grid, trench lines, hidden gun ports, secondary tunnels. Infantry, this is your opening, he radios. Marines surge forward behind the armored wall. 4 Japanese soldiers watching from concealed positions. Disbelief has turned to grim acceptance. The mountain has not stopped the tanks. The slopes have not swallowed them, and the steel continues to climb. March 10th, 1945. Northern Pocket, Iwo Jima. Snow does not fall on Iwo Jima, but ash drift down like it. Lieutenant Kenji Takahashi crouches near a tunnel exit carved into the side of shattered ridge north of Hill 382. The defensive perimeter has contracted into isolated pockets. Ammunition is scarce. Communication lines are severed more often than they function. But the tanks are still coming. The rumble reaches them first, distant, mechanical, steady. Not the chaos of bombardment. Not the staccato rhythm of rifle fire. Engines. Across the broken landscape, Shermans of the 4th and 5th Tank Battalions move in coordinated pairs, covering one another as they advance over slopes previously considered too fractured and steep for armor. Some tanks bear fresh welds and patchwork repairs. Others carry improvised sandbag armor along their flanks. Captain Hollister's tank climbs a jagged incline overlooking a suspected tunnel complex. The driver keeps the throttle controlled, careful not to spin the tracks in loose ash. 25 degrees, the driver calls out. Keep her steady, Hollister replies. They crest. Below them lies the entrance to a command tunnel, partially concealed by rock and netting. From this height, the camouflage is useless. Target that opening. The 75mm gun fires. The shell detonates just inside the entrance, sending smoke and debris outward in a violent burst. Inside the tunnel, Takahashi is thrown to one knee. Dust blinds him. The overhead timbers creak. They're firing from above. A soldier gasped above that. IT is the word that defines this battle now. Japanese defensive doctrine relied on controlling elevation, forcing attackers uphill into predetermined kill zones. But American armor has inverted that logic. Tanks have seized slopes and ridges once believed impassable, using elevation to expose bunker roofs, ventilation shafts, and rear entrances. The 2nd Sherman positions itself slightly higher, its hull angled from maximum depression. The bow machine gun rakes the rocky ledges below, preventing any counter-movement. Corporal Herrera moves cautiously behind the armor, his boots slipping on ash as he descends toward the shattered tunnel mouth. He glances back at the tank perched above him. A 33-ton Guardian on Volcanic Rock Point 2 weeks ago. He would have laughed at the idea. Nearby, Japanese anti-tank team attempts one final maneuver. Armed with magnetic mines, they crawl along a concealed trench toward the Sherman's blind side. But the tank commander spots movement. Infantry right. 50 yards. The coaxial machine gun chatters. The trench falls silent. That be why mid-afternoon. The northern ridges are dotted with American tanks occupying positions once reserved for artillery observers. From these heights, They fired downward methodically, collapsing the remaining defensive pockets. In his tunnel, Takahashi steadies himself against the wall. The fortress still stands in fragments, but its illusion is gone. The terrain has failed them. The slopes that were meant to shield have instead become platforms for American guns, and the steel presence above is constant, unrelenting. March 16th, 1945. Northern Iwo Jima. Rain begins before dawn, a thin, cold drizzle that turns volcanic ash into slick paste. Captain Hollister stands in the open hatch of his Sherman, scanning the final ridgelines where resistance still flickers. The island has officially been declared secured in the southern sectors, but in the north, pockets of Japanese soldiers continue to fight from deep tunnel systems. The terrain here is worse than anywhere else on the island. Jagged crests, narrow defile, steep scarps shattered by weeks of bombardment. IT should be armor's enemy. Instead, it has become its proving ground. Engine steady, the driver reports. Hollister nods. We go around the draw. The draw ahead, a narrow gully between two ridges, is exactly the kind of terrain Japanese defenders plan to exploit. Mines, pre-sighted mortars, overlapping machine gun fire. The Sherman turns away from it. Instead, it climbs a broken slope to the right, angling upward in a slow, grinding ascent. Tracks bite into wet ash. The tank fishtails briefly, then regains traction. Below, Marines watch in tense silence. Didn't think she'd make that, Herrera mutters. But she doesn't make the crest. Hollister sees into the rear of a trench network that faces the draw. Japanese soldiers wait below, weapons trained on the empty gully, prepared to unleash fire on infantry that will never come that way. Fire at will, Hollister orders quietly. The 75mm gun flashes. The first shell detonates inside the trench line. The second collapses a reinforced firing point. Marines surge into the draw moments later, meeting far less resistance than anticipated. Inside a surviving tunnel chamber, Lieutenant Takahashi hears the concussions from an unfamiliar direction. He closes his eyes as realization settles fully. The island's defensive blueprint. Months of engineering, thousands of labor hours, carefully plotted arcs of fire, depended on terrain dictating movement. But the Americans refused to let terrain dictate. They adapted their Shermans with extended grousers for traction. They used engineers to stabilize approaches. They accepted mechanical risk to gain positional advantage. They climbed where climbing seemed irrational. And each time a tank crested an impossible slope, the psychological effect rippled outward. Safe zones disappeared. Rear areas became front lines. Elevated sanctuaries turned into targets by afternoon. Shermans occupy the final dominant ridges overlooking the northern ravines. From these heights, they deliver precise, downward fire into remaining cave systems. Corporal Herrera pauses beside Hollister's tank as it idles against the gray sky. The engine's rumble feels almost ordinary now, familiar, dependable. We thought this place would swallow everything, Herrera says. Hollister looks across the scarred island. Steel climbs, he replies. Below them, the last organized resistance fractures. The illusion that the volcano itself would defend its garrison has shattered completely. March 26th, 1945. Iwo Jima. The official announcement comes at 0900 hours. The island is secured. There is no cheering on the northern ridges. Only wind moving across broken volcanic rock and the low idle of engines cooling after weeks of strain. Captain James Hollister climbs down from his Sherman and removes his helmet. The tank's hull is scarred with impact marks, its tracks worn smooth in places where steel ground relentlessly against ash and stone. Behind him, Marines move cautiously through the last cleared tunnel entrances, rifles lowered but not slung. The fighting has cost too much for celebration. Across the devastated slopes, Shermans stand in positions that would have seemed absurd a month earlier. Perched on terraces, angled along ridgelines, overlooking collapsed bunker roofs. Some sit halfway up inclines once labeled tank impassable in Japanese planning documents. Corporal Miguel Herrera runs his hand along the tank side. "Never thought I'd see one up there," he says quietly, glancing toward the high ground north of Hill 382. Neither did the defenders. Inside a shattered tunnel chamber, Lieutenant Kenji Takahashi sits against a cracked concrete wall, wounded and exhausted. The rumble of engines has finally faded. The defensive system he trusted, designed under the direction of General Tadamaki Kurabayashi, had maximized terrain, discipline, and concealment. IT had inflicted devastating casualties, but it could not account for adaptation at scale. American forces in the Pacific had once struggled to employ armor effectively on small, rugged islands. Coral reefs, jungles, and steep gradients limited mobility. Yet on Iwo Jima, the combination of modified M4A3 Shermans, extended track grousers, close infantry coordination, and relentless engineering support transformed volcanic slopes into avenues of assault. Terrain once believed protective became exposed under armored pressure. Hollister walks a short distance uphill and turns to look back toward the beaches where the invasion began. The black sand is distant now, a thin, dark band against the Pacific. From here, the island feels smaller. Not because it changed, but because it was climbed in the weeks that followed. Military analysts would study Iwo Jima carefully. They would note how armor, when used flexibly and aggressively, could neutralize elevation advantages long considered decisive. They would examine how defensive doctrine tied too tightly to assumptions about impassable terrain could unravel when confronted with innovation. For the soldiers who fought there, the lesson was simpler. The volcano did not stop the tanks. The slopes did not hold. Steel had climbed where it was not supposed to climb, and in doing so, it altered the battle's balance. As the wind moves across Mount Suribachi and the shattered northern ridges, the marks of steel tracks remain etched faintly into the ash, proof that even the most forbidding ground can yield when challenged.